Amanda Leland just recently took the role of Executive Director at the Environmental Defense Fund, and we're so pleased to have you here.
Thank you.
And so pleased to be partnered with EDF. Sit down.
Thank you.
Amanda, you've been there 18 years?
Just about 18 years.
And
never thought I'd be a lifer anywhere.
So let me just tell you quickly what EDF is, to spare Amanda the need to do that. So global nonprofit has used science, economics, partnerships, and strategic litigation to drive environmental progress for over 50 years. It was started working on DDT by a bunch of scientists. Fred Krupp, who's been on Techonomy stage more than once, has led it for a long time. Amanda's now his right-hand person. So I want to just start by asking you to assess where we are with climate and climate action at the macro level.
Well, the news is pretty dour, sad, disappointing. Every day you wake up and you see the tragedy unfolding right before us. It's disheartening. At the same time, if you had asked me that question 3 years ago, I would have felt almost hopeless. And I say almost for a specific reason, which is that hopeless pushes you into a situation where you feel like you have to give up. You have no options. But in the last few years, there have been dramatic shifts in the system, in the understanding, in the awareness, in the readiness to actually get to the solutions that are going to make the biggest difference. So I consider myself a practical optimist. Practical because it's all about getting the work done, and optimistic because, well, society has proven time and time again that we actually can solve big problems. And if there was ever a big problem to solve, climate change is it.
So do you feel like society then is getting somewhat more motivated? There are these positive signs.
Absolutely.
It still feels like we have a big lift to get to the level of motivation we need, though.
Somebody recently said to me that we're at a point where we're like at base camp on Mount Everest. Like we've climbed this big hill, but we still have the hardest part to go. And I think that's actually a really good analogy of where we are today. There's been a lot of progress because people are ready, because companies are starting to take action, because some governments are starting to take action, because people are the power that are going to drive this change, are pushing like never before. And I think we're at that point now. It's make or break. We've got a huge steep climb ahead, but the solutions really are at hand. And they are possible. I
want to talk about the solutions, but I have to say, I find myself frustrated so often. I mean, I'm an inveterate reader of the New York Times, for example. There was this great Ben Smith column, I think on Monday, about this apparently quite amazing new movie, Don't Look Up, which is a metaphor for our failure with climate action. And he talked a lot about media's failures. But just in the days before, the Times had covered the tornadoes with barely a mention of climate change. In fact, they even had a paragraph at one point deprecating the idea that there could be a connection, which is idiotic, because even if tornadoes per se are not caused by climate change, the idea that there was this huge mass of warm air over central United States in December is an aberrant thing that is climate change related. And they did not even make that connection. So it was maddening to me. One part of the New York Times understands it, one part doesn't. So anyway,
can I just say on that note, I mean, this is going to sound really trite or glib, but it kind of doesn't matter because people are experiencing these things in their daily lives. And that's what makes the difference. Whether the scientists say X or Y on the one storm or the other storm, that's important. It's important to get the facts right. But the real situation is that this is bearing down on us today. And people's families and communities are feeling that challenge.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you said to me as we were prepping was that we have to figure out what we want rather than dwelling on what we've lost. So what do we want?
Well, can I, again, just hold on that comment for just a moment, because I think a lot of people, this is a hard thing for a lot of people to hear, which is like, we have to mourn the reality that we're not going to live in the world tomorrow that we had yesterday. It's just, that's a state of fact. We have to reconcile that. And that takes a lot for humanity to really think about and understand. But What it's all about is getting down to the business of figuring out what we want, designing for the future that we want. There is no reason that the future for all of us and for all of our kids can't be better than it has been for us. We have to redefine what good looks like. We have to decide who we want to be and how we want our society to operate. And that, I think, involves breaking down inequalities. I think that involves ensuring that everybody has access to clean energy, to clean transportation. I think that involves everybody being able to participate in an economy where they can have jobs and livelihoods that actually benefit the planet and benefit society. And that's all possible as we make this transition. We just have to be really intentional about it.
Okay, so talk about what some of EDF's top priorities are in that context.
So first I'm going to start with one that has gotten a lot of press coverage recently, but is still, I think, underappreciated, which is solving the problem of methane. Methane. So methane is the main component of natural gas. A lot of us have natural gas in our homes or businesses. 10 years ago, nobody was really talking about methane. CO2, carbon dioxide, was the major thing that everybody was focused on, and they should be, just to be clear, they should absolutely be. But carbon dioxide is really about how chaotic and warm the planet is going to be well into the future. Methane, the problem of methane, is really about how chaotic and hot our planet is going to be in the next decade or 2 decades. It is the problem of today. In fact, of all the fossil fuel emissions this year, methane will do more to warm the planet in the next decade than carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. And it is imminently solvable. It is not a huge problem that requires lots of, innovation. It's a problem of addressing plumbing. It's a leaking problem from basically our oil and gas system. So it's valves, it's pipes. If we can stop the leaks, we can make a huge difference in the warming that we are experiencing now. And so EDF is really doubling down on this. We are working at the highest level, meaning out in space. We are working to build with partners Methane Sat, which is going to track with very high precision where these leaks are occurring, where methane emissions are occurring, so that we know and we can hold polluters accountable. We're working at the ground level with communities. Methane is also a significant contributor of smog. Smog causes children's asthma. And working in communities to address leaks, to find and fix these problems can make a huge difference for kids' lives today. We're working, for example, in supporting the Navajo Nation in their EPA, designing rules to ensure that there's less methane emissions on their lands. We're working at the federal and state governments in the United States to ensure that there's a strong rules in place to ensure that the industry does what it can do with little to no cost, which is solving this methane problem.
Well, for many years, EDF was almost the only group talking about methane. And you've had a tremendous success recently with this massive global agreement that was announced in Glasgow. So talk quickly about what that was.
Hallelujah is all I can say, because you don't solve this problem as the only organization saying it needs to be solved. The only way we address these problems is when we work together, and we have a broad coalition of partners. So it's great. We've now sort of hit the methane moment, and there was a global methane pledge that was announced at COP26, the global climate meeting last month. I can't remember what month it is. 100 countries have signed up to reduce methane emissions 30% by 2030. That is a significant breakthrough.
It was the first global agreement of that type ever.
Ever, yeah.
What can ordinary people and companies do on this methane thing? Or is it one of those issues where there isn't much that we can do to help?
All right, here's the first thing I'm going to ask you to do, which is call the EPA and tell them that we need strong federal methane rules. There's a proposed rule out. It's very important. It's the most ambitious rule that there can be, but there are some loopholes that could be considered that would, and we need to close those loopholes. And specifically around, there are a lot of wells out there that are very marginal in their production, but they leak excessive amount of methane emissions. Let's close those wells. We don't need to see that problem. That's an easy thing to do. So anyway, first thing, get active. Second thing, as you look to your natural gas supplier, ask them to disclose where their natural gas is coming from. That's something we can all do, because transparency is really important to knowing whether the industry is doing what it can to reduce methane emissions.
Okay, good. I want to just mention again, for those who are watching online, and we do have quite a few people doing that, you're more than welcome to ask questions. We'll get to those in a little while. People in the room also think about the questions you might have for Amanda before we wrap. The idea of an equitable transition, which you referred to at the beginning, both in the US and globally, is a big priority for EDF. Talk a little more about that.
So this is where we can meet multiple objectives at the same time, because there's power in that, and it's so important to do. The people who are most at risk from climate change are the people who have often been shut out of a system, marginalized, or are most vulnerable. In this country, your zip code is one of your key determinants of your health. Where you live and what you have access to, and different communities have different access, and your health relies on that. So addressing inequality in this country and how where pollution comes from and what it means in your community is so important. Globally, there's this huge opportunity in driving equity through to support developing countries from the developed world. So the developed world has done the most pollution, the US being one of the principal actors here. But the US and other developed countries has a role in helping to build and support the build out of a sustainable, clean economy in the developing world. And there's a huge opportunity here to do that, which solves for both the inequality, but also the climate problem.
Right. I mean, and it's really vexing because we have no right to insist those countries stop developing when we live with this absurdly excessive, wasteful lifestyle that Americans still indulge in. They're still living in a very efficient manner, but at a much lower economic level. And so we must allow them and encourage them to grow economically, but we've got to basically allow that to happen in a sustainable fashion. It's challenging.
This is not a zero-sum game. This is a rising tide raises all ships opportunity. It's true here, and it's true in other parts of the world. And I think that's really important. And I think that's actually how we drive change, because that's how you get more people to see themselves in the future solution.
You know, one of our speakers later, I think, may talk about this, but the US being the kind of primary cause, the single biggest country in terms of causing the problem thus far, historically. I mean, we could even have legal consequences of that if we don't take action globally. And I mean, I don't know what you think about this, but do you feel like there is a sense of equity in the world right now, or is the developing world increasingly feeling that they are getting a raw deal and we are not abiding by with our obligations or sticking to our obligations?
I think the way to think about this is what the opportunity is to go forward, not focus on who said what and what, like where the blame lies. Because I think that we actually need to view the future as being better and not sort of get stuck in the past. And yes. So for example, how can this be done? Can we talk about tropical deforestation is one of the big issues around, one of the big sources of potential climate pollution. Cutting down rainforests or stopping the cutting of rainforests is one of the most urgent things we can do relative to carbon dioxide pollution. It's within reach. And most of those tropical rainforests are in other countries, in developing countries. And there's a real opportunity for companies and for governments to support the protection of these tropical forests, and for the indigenous peoples that live in these forests and the communities that surround them to be more secure and more healthy because they protect their forests and because they're being supported to do so by governments and countries that are looking to solve these problems. In my view, it's a real win-win. Now, there's a lot of issues around design. There's a lot of issues around engagement and input by the people on the ground, those communities that need to be absolutely at the center of developing these approaches. But there is real power in that kind of solution.
How would you kind of characterize the state of governmental action in the United States? I mean, we've got this Build Back Better bill that's sort of stalled. If it were to pass, how big of a deal is that? And how do you look at the Biden administration's efforts in the big picture?
I'm going to hope that it's not stalled. So, I mean, some reporters will say it's stalled. I'm saying it's still going to happen. Build Back Better will be the most important piece of climate legislation in the US ever.
Wow.
And it will help people in their regular lives. So if it passes, when it passes, it will reduce the average family's energy cost by $500 a year. That's about a third of the total cost. It will support our families to buy solar power for their houses and to buy electric vehicles. It will change the terms of the debate for us all because it will make it accessible for each of us to participate in this new net zero or climate friendly world, because we will be able to help transition our homes and our communities in that direction. It is by far the most important thing that can happen to build the systems and the infrastructure and the incentives that will get us collectively on the path towards real progress.
Well, I'm glad I asked you that. There's so many things to discuss, and I don't want to overlook the questions from the audience. So if somebody has one, get your hand up or get it on the screen. Yes. Okay. I didn't see that. So go right ahead. Shout it out, please.
Hi, my name is Nicholas. I have a question for you. You're saying about the methane that
Hold it up.
it's mostly coming from the oil the oil and gas industry, but there's data out there saying it's mostly coming from the food supply chain and landfill. I wonder if the idea is that it's easier to finger point at the oil industry versus finger pointing at the food supply chain itself, because it involves more people. So wanted to have a take on that.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to say that most of the methane pollution is coming from the oil and gas industry. It is sizable. It's, I don't know, maybe 40%. But it is a huge, huge dent, and it's where we can make the most progress in the near term and where it's most solvable. To your point, agriculture is about just over 50% totally globally of methane emissions from livestock, and then there's food waste emissions also. So there's a lot of different sources. Well, there's about 4 primary different sources. Solving the ag methane challenge is critically important. I don't mean to say that there's not a need for innovation and policy around that, and real incentives. Really, it's about an incentives approach. But it's harder to do. It's harder to do. And if we're looking for solutions that can make the biggest difference now and ensure that we're on the path of the least warming globally that we can be, solving for the oil and gas sector is definitely a high priority.
Yeah, there's a lot of things in agriculture like no-till farming and things that really could make a big difference that have not generally been adopted. So it's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
We have a session. But, okay, real quick. Yeah.
Really quick. Do you believe mass adoption of vegetarianism or veganism is going to be important or critical for sustainability?
Like, say it louder. I can't hear you.
Food choice is an individual choice. So he's asking, should everybody become a vegan in order to stop climate change?
Thank you.
Food choice is an individual choice. I think there are going to be real important innovations that happen in the food sector over time. but how those play out in different cultures and different contexts, I'm not going to, there's my microphone. I'm not going to be the person, and EDF isn't going to be the organization to tell people how they should eat and what they should eat. What we can do is put the solutions in place today. They're going to make the biggest difference over the long term, that are system level solutions that drive, overall impact.
Well, it's good that Steve.
But if you're a vegan, then that's great too.
I don't know. Are you a vegan, Steve? You're struggling with it. Okay. Well, Steve is going to moderate a session with a couple of your colleagues in just a little while.
Can I give a shout out to my colleagues?
Well, yes. Well, I was going to mention this session is going to be about environmental and climate justice.
Yes.
So I wanted you to define what is climate and environmental justice, and what will we be discussing then, for example?
Climate, so you should ask Heather and Margot, because they'll give a much more informed answer than I will. How I would define climate and environmental justice is ensuring that the people who are most vulnerable are the first protected.
Okay, that's succinct. But did you finish?
Yeah, I mean, you could take that in a lot of different directions and talk about how then you get to that outcome. But I think that's the summary statement. The people who are most vulnerable, and those, again, you can see who those people are. You can look at it on a map. The people who are most vulnerable should be the first protected.
Okay, here's a question that you're uniquely suited to ask. EDF's, one of the things that has distinguished EDF throughout its history is that it was willing and eager to work with business to achieve the results that it identified as necessary. I wrote about that in Fortune magazine in 1998, actually. I think, or maybe even earlier. That's when I first met Fred, by the way.
Not to say we've not been at this for some time.
You've been at it for a long time. Well, so clearly I have too, but something. But the question I have is, given this idea of climate justice and environmental justice and the idea of communities and the role of communities and understanding the impact of climate and environmental impacts on communities, given that you have this long history of working with companies, do companies in their own efforts understand that approach to climate action? And if they don't, which I assume is the answer, how do we get them to do so?
So I think that they do. I think actually this is part of the change in understanding of the problem at hand and the need for solutions that are going to impact people in their daily lives. I actually think that there's a real move in this direction. Now, not every company can work in every community, right? Because that just might not be their remit. But those that do can, or those that can are starting to. And so, for example, we have a partnership with IKEA here in the New York metro area. And they've made a commitment to what they call zero pollution delivery. And this is all about last mile clean delivery of their products to your door. And so we're working with them to figure out how they can do that. They don't own their own trucks. They're not Amazon. So they've got to lease their trucks somewhere else. They got to, so issues around supply of those trucks, how that's maintained in the business arrangements. And there's not a lot of EV trucks yet, right? So you got to figure out how you get those in the system. So we're working with companies like IKEA to figure this out. And if we clean up transportation in cities and in communities, we clean the air and we will help the most vulnerable.
Okay. In our session immediately preceding this, we heard from Google that one of the countries they're focusing on with their job in small business development is India.
Yes.
India is also a huge priority for you. We've just got a tiny bit of time left.
Yes.
Why is India so important to EDF?
Well, India is one of the 4 biggest potential and current sources of global climate emissions. So Europe, India, China, the US rank high on all of those. So those 4 matter. India is also a place where there's going to be the need to develop that country in a way that's clean and supportive of health outcomes for people. And so there's a real opportunity. Our work in India is all about supporting entrepreneurs, companies, and others, and the government to solve these problems in a practical way, in a way that works in an Indian context.
Okay, and I know you've also been in China for 20 years. That's a huge operation for you. We don't really have time to discuss it, but I want to just mention that we will have a very extensive breakout session a little bit after 11, as Amanda mentioned, with 2 of her great colleagues who are here, and Steve and Esther Dyson talking about justice in the climate and environmental context so we can delve further into a lot of these things. It's so great to be working with EDF. And I will also say, Techonomy is intending with EDF to create an event in this late winter, early spring called Techonomy Climate. We're very excited about that, and we're excited to be working with you more on that. So thank you so much.
We need more. Okay, thank you all.